Welcome in, everyone. You're listening to Bulls Central. I'm joined me today with another special guest, longtime writer covering the Bulls, the Warriors as well, podcaster for the Bulls from Bulls HQ days, and now the beat writer covering the Bulls for CHGO, the All City Network. It is my pleasure to welcome back to the show Will Gottlieb of CHGO. Will, it's good to see you, my man, and appreciate you making the time.
It's great to be back here. Yeah, always excited to talk Bulls with you.
Now, if you're not already, of course, make sure to give Will a follow on Twitter at Will_Gottlieb. Check out all the great work at CHGO. And of course, I'm sure most of you already, but check out the CHGO Sports channel. Give it a sub. It's one of the best podcasts and talk shows out there for Bulls fans. I'll leave a link to all that in the description. So, Will, we'll talk about this past season a bit. I don't want to focus too much on that, considering it's probably a season I think most of us Bulls fans would like to forget. So instead, we'll talk more about this offseason, upcoming free agency, the draft, whether Bulls will actually be keeping their pick, and of course, what to expect for this upcoming season. But where I wanted to start actually was the most recent news that came out last week. I believe it was first reported by Darnell Mayberry of The Athletic. The Chicago Bulls offered Arturas Karnisovas a contract extension. And it wasn't actually last week when the contract extension was handed to him, when it was announced. It was yet again another secret extension, if you will, similar to what Billy Donovan got earlier on in the season, but a secret extension for AK that happened weeks ago. And I wanted to ask you, because you've been covering the game basketball for a while now. You're going to know the ins and outs of the team and their inner workings, given the role that you have as a reporter. Is that unusual or out of ordinary for a team to give out these secret extensions to their coaching staff and front office and have it come out publicly after the fact? Or is this the norm and Bulls fans are just kind of blowing this out of proportion?
I think it's a little bit of both. We do hear some contractual stuff with regards to other president of basketball operations, GMs around the league. Bob Myers is coming up on his contract over there near you in the Bay. And obviously, like when Daryl Morey gets hired, we hear about that. But I think for the most part, it's just like hirings and firings. We
Mm-hmm.
don't really hear necessarily about like the money or the years on a lot of these contracts.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, that was not as surprising as maybe the Billy Donovan one, which was sort of conveniently announced as soon as fans started turning their head towards Billy
Right.
and started pointing fingers for some of the issues with the team this year. And I think it honestly is kind of the same thing with Arturas right now, where fans are unhappy with the way that the season went, obviously, as they should be. And they're in a tough spot financially with limited draft capital, very few avenues to improve the roster. And so I think heads are starting to turn towards Arturas. And so it doesn't necessarily surprise me that this news comes out of he's going to be around. His head is not on the chopping block. This is something that he's going to have to figure his way out of, but it is going to be him that does it. So to me, the coaching news, I think, is something that we usually hear a little bit more of the details about in terms of contract and length and money. And so that sort of secret extension was a little bit more surprising to me, especially with 2 more years on his contract. Billy Donovan's was, and Arturas, I guess I always kind of expected him to be around for the long haul, so it's not as surprising. But again, I think it's more the trend of the lack of transparency around some of these extensions and deals that's sort of surprising and maybe disappointing some fans.
Yeah, I mean, that was the biggest thing for me because I think I mentioned on my channel as well. When you hire an executive, you generally speaking, you're going to expect them to be around for a long time. You're not just going to give them the axe a couple of years in. I mean, Garpax were with the organization for a really long time, but the Billy Donovan extension did surprise me. Like you mentioned, 2 years still left on his deal. You would have thought, hey, maybe let's see how the season plays out and then think about considering a contract extension, because it's not like he was on an expiring deal where they needed to get something done. To me, that was overall a bit of a shock. Do we know when he actually signed the extension? Because that also could be pretty telling. There was reports coming out that it was around the time at the end of the season or going into the play-in, or do we not have that visibility and information? Not talking about Billy Donovan, of course, talking about AK.
Yeah, we don't have the specifics, but Joe Cowley of the Sun-Times did have similar reporting a little bit earlier on in the season. So I think it would have to have been as early as last summer or some point during the season. But we don't know for sure. And I can try to find that article while we're chatting here.
Yeah, and it would be, interesting if, yeah, because I think, at the end of the day, you're talking about a lot of fans frustrated with initially the coaching, now it's at the front office, and then also the players as well. And so to have it happen in a secret way, I think also is letting the fan base not blow things out of proportion, but at the same time, we're going to when it feels like things aren't being revealed to us in a transparent way. But not that it's really any of our business how they handled, the everything within the front office. But we can gripe about the extensions all we want. The fact of the matter is Billy Donovan, AK, they're here for the long term. I did want to actually talk about AK's end of season press conference. For the most part, I think most Bulls fans would agree wasn't the best, presser, pretty uninspiring. Didn't really give you a lot of confidence for this upcoming season that this team, has, given the whole situation they found themselves in with limited draft capital, trade assets, very little wiggle room on the cap sheet. While yes, there was some accountability on the part of AK for it being a disappointing season, which is more accountability than we saw at the end of the trade deadline presser. At the same time, there was a bit of patting themselves on the back. Hey, our record was 14-9 post All-Star break. We're making strides in the right direction. I know you've talked about this a lot on the podcast, as well as your articles at CHGO. Realistically, what do you think this front office could do this offseason between running it back, maybe doing a bit of retooling, or the full tear it down rebuild situation?
Yeah, I mean that's what we're all waiting to see. It's funny because you mentioned some accountability, but also some patting on the back, and I think that kind of hedges both sides, right? Like you could see why AK would say, well, we did finish 14-9, and we did have a competitive run down the stretch, and I'm sure everybody saw that Jerry Reinsdorf interview from the other week where he said that competitive games down the stretch is all fans can really ask for, and that's how you have a successful season. That's kind of what the Bulls put together. So from ownership standpoint, if that is a success, then that is a success. And if you're the VP of basketball operations, why would you really go against that? So I'm not expecting a full teardown, but that brings up the question of how do you improve? And do you think it's worth trying to improve around the current group? And that's where things get a little bit difficult. Part of it is out of their hands with Vooch. Does he want to come back? If so, for how long? How much do you give him? Do you try to line it up with DeMar DeRozan's contract, which is up after the upcoming season? Do you try to extend him further down the line and match him up more with Zach? Does he just leave it and walk for nothing? And then what do you do with the center spot and the space? So I think what's difficult there is even if Vooch does walk, assuming the Bulls want to bring back Coby and Ayo, they're still going to be above the salary cap, which means that they're not going to have a huge salary slot to go give, that $22 million that Vooch is making to another free agent. Yeah. So they will have to be a little bit creative. But you also have the luxury tax limitations. And so if you bring back Vooch and those guys that I mentioned before, now you're right up against the tax, and it becomes nearly impossible to bring anybody else in if you're not going to go into the tax. And I think that's sort of the safe assessment that we can make, is that the Bulls aren't going to be willing to do that. So it's tricky. No draft picks. There's maybe an avenue to squeeze the Blazers for the lottery protected pick that they owe the Bulls. They want to be aggressive this summer, finding help for Damian Lillard. Do they maybe give that 23rd pick that they acquired from the Knicks and the Josh Hart deal to the Bulls in exchange for the removal of protections on the Blazers pick? There aren't a ton of options out there, but I don't necessarily see the Bulls blowing it up and trading two of, Zach DeMar and Vooch, or moving on from Vooch and trading one of those guys, which would really be the only way that you could go out and sign a big free agent. So it's going to be, I think, moves on the margins. It's going to be trying to improve, but also with those same limitations that we've seen before, which is limited financial capabilities, limited draft capital, and not willing to go into the tax. It's going to be a tricky summer.
I'm curious, do you think part of the reason AK has been, so non-committal in his approach toward the offseason, saying we're going to look at everything, but at the same time expressing the desire to re-sign all their free agents, do you think part of it is because they more or less know that they're backed in a corner with the limited options they have and making meaningful moves to improve the roster? So by saying things like, hey, we're heading in the right direction after going 14-9 post All-Star break, is that really just like a coping mechanism or a way to deflect and accepting, well, we hope this roster is heading in the right direction and that we're going to be better because there really isn't much we can do about it? Do you get kind of that sense? Because I think a lot of frustration from fans is, hey, AK is just acting like we're dumb here, but it's like I think he's just accepting the fact that there's not really a lot they can do.
Yeah, I think that's probably a huge part of it. That there aren't a lot of options, and I think they definitely know that. I mean, they're smarter than we are, so I'm sure they see it. And I think it's just like because some of it is out of their hands, they can't really commit either way to anything. Um, with Vooch being a free agent here, and Coby's restricted, these guys could go out and get offers from other teams and leave the Bulls with nothing. And if that's the case, then now they'll sort of be forced into doing something. If the mandate is to be a competitive team down the stretch, they'll need to find ways to do that. But they'll also have the ability to go find guys. But if those guys want to come back and they see that as the best way forward, then you're right. I mean, their hands are kind of tied. There's not much they can do in the way of additions, even if they want to bring Patrick Beverley back. And that's really the head scratcher to me is like you're so encouraged by this 14-9 stretch. Well, Patrick Beverley was a huge part of that. And if you're going to bring back Vooch and Coby, it becomes very difficult to even bring back Pet Bev. So it's going to be tricky, and they obviously know that. But I think once some of the other dominoes start to fall around the league with Vooch, it becomes a little bit more easy to pick a direction and make some decisions. But I'll say this, we heard Masai Ujiri talk after the Raptors let Nick Nurse go, and they've got a similar situation where they're up against a hard line. They've got free agents in Jakob Poeltl and Gary Trent in Fred VanVleet. They've had rumors around Pascal Siakam and OG Anunoby for months now, but there was no, well, we did pretty good down the stretch. And they did. They were just as good as the Bulls down the stretch after trading for Jakob Poeltl. Obviously, right. The Bulls beat them in the play-in. But they committed to improving and finding ways to change things up such that they could improve. And I think that was sort of the disappointing part of the presser for me and for probably a lot of fans, where there wasn't a commitment to trying to improve, even if they were encouraged by the way that they finished down the stretch.
Right. I did want to talk about Vucevic. I had Casey Johnson on a couple weeks ago. At that time, I had asked him if there had been any progress toward a contract extension for Vuce, since he's set to become an unrestricted free agent July 1st. Obviously, he said, yeah, I'm sure both sides are probably working towards the deal. Discussions are being had, but it was nothing definitive. Any update from what you're hearing on Vuce and his impending free agency, as far as any contract extension conversations that are being had?
Nothing that I'm hearing in terms of reporting, but my guess would be that, they start to see what's going on around the rest of the league in terms of how do these teams finish in the playoffs? Do some of these teams that had, like the Bucks, for example, had really high aspirations and just needed to make some major changes. They just fired Bud after losing in the first round. Are there going to be other situations in teams like that who feel the need to shake things up or want to go out and improve at the center spot? Do those opportunities open for Vooch? And if so, how does that affect the Bulls' ability to try to retain him? So I think they're just going to play this out on its natural course and sort of see if there are any other, suitors around the rest of the league. And if not, then maybe come to an agreement on an extension before July 1st. But I would be surprised if that happens at this point, just because we don't know what's going on around the rest of the league.
Yeah, and I think the other important piece in all of this, which I want to talk about, we got an important date coming up, May 16th, where Bulls fans will be waiting on bated breath to see if they can get a miracle from the basketball gods. 8.5% chance of landing in the top four, 1.8% chance of getting the real prize, the number one pick. Obviously, that will play an overall factor into the Bulls and how they approach free agency, specifically with Vucevic. Obviously, a very unlikely scenario. The Bulls will be keeping their pick. Even more unlikely a shot at Victor Wembanyama. But crazier things have happened, right? The Bulls did win the lottery in 2008, which landed them Derrick Rose. If the Bulls do hit the jackpot and get the number one pick, how does that change the overall direction and approach in this offseason, as well as just the trajectory of the franchise going forward?
I mean, I guess it depends on where you land. Wembanyama would obviously be a franchise-changing player for the next decade. And I think, Scoot Henderson is definitely a step down from that, but he could be the franchise point guard that the Bulls have been looking for since Derrick. And I really like Brandon Miller and Amen Thompson, who sort of round out the top four. This draft is loaded, especially at the top, and it's too bad that the Bulls gave up their pick in a year where there was so much potential star talent.
Right.
I think there are still some cap questions of how you fit those pieces together. Right now, they don't have that salary cap hold on the books for a high rookie pick because they don't have that. But obviously, if they do move in, they'll have to move some other pieces around, or maybe they even look to trade that pick to package it for another established star
Sure.
player that they could get to try to continue to be competitive now. So I could see anything being on the table. If you land Wembanyama, you'd be insane to move on from him, and I doubt they would do that. But with the commitment to compete, I would say anything is possible because similar to the Blazers, who I mentioned before, guys like Damian Lillard aren't really waiting around for a Brandon Miller and a Men Thompson to be ready to compete around a 32-year-old. And that's kind of the position the Bulls are in. Do they want to wait or do they want to go all in now? And, that could even include trading Patrick Williams or Coby White or moving on from some of the young guys that are currently on the roster to try to go all in. So I'm not saying I expect any of that. I would be surprised if it did happen, but if the Bulls are trying to compete, they have to look at all avenues because at the end of the day, what they have is not good enough. They missed the playoffs. They lost in the play-in, and if the goal is to make the playoffs, they need to find a way to get better. And let's not forget, like they were the 12th seed before the Pacers and the Wizards decided to do the right thing and go for the bottom. So this was not a successful run, even at the end of the season. They need to find a way to get better. Limited ways to do that, but they're going to have to get creative.
I actually was curious to hear your thoughts on that because I have seen a lot of Bulls fans talking about if they do land in the top four or even get the number one pick, they should do what the Bears did, right? And trade it for an
Yeah,
insane
exactly.
haul, trade it for another top pick as well as multiple future first rounders. I personally don't agree with that. I think if you do get the number one pick and you have the opportunity to draft a prospect of a lifetime, you do that. But what are your thoughts? Like what do you think realistically, let's say they get the number one pick, and I know this is, extreme hypotheticals because it's very unlikely. If they get the number one pick, what do you think realistically would you be able to get in a return for a prospect like Wembanyama?
I've played this game a little bit with some friends. I'm not sure. I'm not sure there are like five players in the league that you wouldn't trade for Wembanyama. It's like Steph. I mean, would Mark Cuban trade Luca for Wembanyama? Probably not. But like that's a discussion.
Yeah.
Jason Tatum, would you trade for Wemby? Um, I don't know. Jokic probably not. Embiid probably not. But he's I mean that special of a player and that valuable of an asset. So if you're gonna do it, you would have to be crazy, but you could also get an absolute haul. And I think if the Bulls are trying to be competitive this year, it's even more reason to draft him because there's
Right.
not going to be a rookie in the next several years that's as ready to be a competitive player now. And he would be a great fit next to Vooch if you decided to bring him back. He gives you that rim protection. He can move his feet a little bit. He adds a floor spacer. I mean, that would be a fantastic fit. He'd be a fantastic fit anywhere. But if you land that number one pick or even two, I would be shocked. And I think that does track with what the Bulls have shown their plan to be, which is to bring in some veteran win now guys into DeRozan and Vooch, but sort of cater the timeline around Zach Lavine. And in doing so, continue to try to develop some of those younger guys on the roster. They did move on from a handful, but the fact that they never moved Patrick or Coby tells me that they are still committed to building up organically through their own sort of farm system or equivalent.
So fantasy land aside, because again, very small chance the Bulls keep their pick. Assume the Bulls don't, they send it to Orlando, most likely scenario. What do the Bulls need to do this offseason? Or I guess I should say realistically, what can be done to improve the roster? I know we talked about the limited options that they have, but from your view, play GM for a moment. What can be done? What can be done to actually make concrete moves to improve the roster with what they have?
Yeah, it's funny when you start to ask these questions because I think a lot of fans get really attached to some of the younger guys on the team, but at the same time, they haven't necessarily contributed to winning at the highest level. And we like what we saw from Coby. Patrick has obviously had some flashes, but if they actually want to be more competitive, then they might need a big upgrade at point guard. They might not want to sort of push Coby back into that position. Or maybe, I mean, we saw Patrick take a bench role down the stretch. Maybe they look to find another bigger wing, power forward type who can help them and be more consistent, higher volume floor spacer while still giving you some defense. But I think it's going to come down to what can you get Coby and Vooch to come back for. I think if you're looking at 18 or so million for Vooch, which is what I wrote last week, sort of the projections would estimate for him. If you're looking at about 14, 15 for Coby, which is what I'll be writing about this week in terms of projections for him, that's not a lot of money to use. You've got your mid-level exception, you've got your biannual exception, and maybe you can stretch those, but it's like you're topping out at 5 million, and how much help can you really get for that number? And that, like I said, is not even to account for Patrick Beverley. So there are going to be some guys, and maybe the Bulls can pitch them on a bigger role with a team that's going to be competitive. But I would say that two areas of obvious need are shooting, and some point guard play to make up for Lonzo. And there are some options out there, but none of them are going to be like quick fixes. I think that's really sort of the realization that fans and the front office has probably already come to, as we talked about.
Right.
There's not going to be like that one guy that comes in for $5 million and turns us into a 48-win team. I just don't think that's out there. So I think the idea will be to find shooting and some more perimeter defense around the fringes, but those are certainly the highest areas of need.
One person that I saw most recently that's been, I guess I shouldn't say connected to the Bulls, but someone that the Bulls should consider pursuing because he's seeking the non-taxpayer mid-level exception is Christian Wood. I don't know if you've heard anything on that, if whether there's any credibility to those rumors. Do you think that might be a viable option to use as the mid-level exception? Also, another scenario, can they? I mean, even despite the fact that they can use it as an exception, it's getting them close to the tax line. Can it be done?
Right. Yeah, and that's kind of where I'm headed here. Is the mid-level exception, I believe, is going to be about 12.2 million. Right. And if they were to use all of that, they would get pushed over the tax line, which, as we've said, is not going to happen. I think depending on the numbers that they bring Vooch and Coby back for, you're going to be looking at around 5 million or so, maybe a little bit less, maybe a little bit more, depending. I've never been a huge Christian Wood fan. He definitely has the ability to produce, but I mean, he fell out of the rotation in that Mavs roster, who just needs any sort of talent. Not a good defensive player, can shoot it a little bit, can score a little bit, can rebound a little bit. But I think some of those more superficial stats are not at all going to be really productive for what the Bulls need. I would prioritize, high volume shooting, like a Seth Curry type, or, if there's a trade that would, allow the Bulls to bring back some money, maybe like Joe Harris or something like that with the Nets, where you're getting like a real knockdown shooter. I mean, there are guys that can shoot and there are shooters, and the Bulls have guys that can shoot, but they need some real shooters.
Talk to me about Dillon Brooks, Will. I saw your tweet. I think Dillon Brooks would be a good fit. Roast me. High volume shooter, doesn't really shoot it at a good clip. What do you think about Dillon Brooks?
Yeah, I mean, I was like Dillon Brooks, trying to stir the pot a little bit, trying to play the heel. But yeah, I mean, he's a talented defensive player. I think that's kind of getting lost in the narrative here. He is a really good big wing defender, and that is a valuable asset to have in the NBA. He can shoot you out of games. Decision making is just not there. Right. And as I talk about on our show all the time, like self-awareness is a huge thing for me, and understanding where to get your shots. But the Bulls need help. And I don't think he would take that kind of smaller contract. I think there's going to be teams that offer him a little bit more, but I wouldn't say no to a super high level defender. Maybe I would, but they do need talent, and I'm just not sure how many other alternatives are going to be out there. Yeah, like, would getting him be better than doing nothing? Probably.
the one thing I'll say about Dillon Brooks, which I don't want Dillon Brooks on the Bulls whatsoever, but the one thing I will say about him is he's a competitor, and the Bulls need competitors, right? Like that was the one benefit of bringing in a guy like Patrick Beverley. They'll fight, right? I mean, they might be somewhat of a headache. They might try to, ruffle feathers with other players on the court, but that's something that's of value. But I'm like you, self-awareness is very key, and there are some Bulls players that sort of lack in that department sometimes when it comes to questionable shot selection, a bit of tunnel vision, creating these isolation heavy plays that slow down the overall offense. That's been the biggest thing for me with Brooks. But I was curious to get your thoughts because I know you
And
mentioned
that's probably enough to deter me. But I do think, if you're a team that's sort of painted into a corner as far as ways you can get better, you do have to consider all your options. I probably, all else considered, probably don't want to go there. But like I said, you do need to find some upgrades somehow.
I'll get you out of here on this one, Will. Biggest surprise move of the offseason for the Bulls. What do you think it'll be?
I think they will find a way into this draft. I think they will find a way to get into the later third of the first round. Obviously, their first second round pick that they acquire will have to go to the league for the tampering fine on Alonzo. Right now, they've got technically the 58th pick, I believe, from the Nuggets, which will be forfeited. So there's no sense in trying to acquire an early second round pick because then that one would have to go to the league. But I do think that there's a chance that they can work out a deal with the Blazers to get back into the first round with that Knicks pick. And like I said, I mean, this draft is loaded. There's going to be really good players even into the 20s. And I think that could really help build up this crop of young players and extend sort of the future of this team and sort of provide an alternative timeline if the Bulls decide to eventually go another direction. But I think that's maybe the most likely surprise, I guess you'd say. I wouldn't be surprised if one of DeMar or Vooch are gone next year, but I would say the odds of that are really low, and I would maybe expect a higher percentage chance of them getting into the first round with the draft pick there.
Talk to us real quick about how that would work as far as the Bulls keeping their Portland pick, because I think a lot of Bulls fans are a bit confused as to how they would go about doing that. And obviously, it impacts the pick that they have that's owed to them from the Knicks. How would that overall work as far as being able to actually get that lottery protected pick to come to them?
Yeah. So back with the Lauri Markkanen trade to Cleveland and two summers ago, the Bulls took back Derek Jones Jr. and a lottery protected first round pick, Larry Nance to the Blazers, who's later on been moved, and Lowry to the Cavs. So with that lottery protected pick, it rolls over to the next year if it does not convey. And that's true every year until 2028. Right. So because of the Stepien rule, the Blazers are not allowed to trade two picks in a row. So because they got their pick protected this year, they retain it. But that means that the Bulls they owe the Bulls their lottery protected pick next year. So they can't trade that until it technically conveys. As I mentioned before, Dame, I think age 32, age 33, just had his best season. They want to compete now. They've got sort of some of the right pillars around him, but they really need to go out and get a second star. And the way to do that, obviously, is to unload the clip with regards to draft picks. So they acquired I believe it was lottery protected pick from the Knicks in a deal that sent New York Josh Hart. Obviously, they are in the playoffs, so that pick is outside the lottery, currently at 23rd. And so in theory, the Blazers could say, Arturas, here's the 23rd pick in this draft. You return us the lottery protected pick that we gave to you, and we are out of our obligation to you. We can now trade all of our future picks, right, and you get a lock in the first round. You automatically get a first round pick in a world where, I mean, if we're not able to figure out a way to build around Dame, we could be in the lottery until 2028 when those obligations run out. So you guaranteed get a pick. We get the flexibility to trade our future picks. Everybody wins. And now the Bulls are back into the first round.
Perfect. Yeah, I think that there's also been this misconception among fans that, would that mean that the Bulls would actually get the current pick that they like? In other words, I think there's been a lot of Bulls fans saying, well, that means that they would just remove the current protection that they have, which means that there's even a higher likelihood that that pick actually could be a top pick, because I think what the Blazers finished with the 6th worst record in the league. But yeah, this I always like try to make it clear to fans that's not actually how it's going to work. It's
No,
that they would
but I
get
will
the
say
Knicks
this.
pick. Yeah,
I will say this. Like the Bulls have a lot of leverage here. I mean, the Blazers, Dame Lillard is basically publicly saying,
yeah,
I'm not messing around on a rebuild.
exactly.
So, for all intents and purposes, reading between the lines here, it's trade me or bring in another star because I'm not
Right.
messing around with the kids anymore. Um, and they've got Anthony Simons, they've got Shaden Sharp, they've got all their future draft picks, assuming they can get their own back here from the Bulls. The Bulls do have a lot of leverage to make this
Yeah,
happen. All right, you want to keep Dame? You want the greatest player in your franchise history to be a Blazer for his career? Like, make it worth our while here. So
yeah,
maybe it's more than the 23rd pick. I highly doubt they would give up the sixth pick to make that happen. Maybe they fall back in the lottery a little bit if some teams jump them.
sure.
But they're going to want to use that higher lottery pick to trade to attach to Simons and bring in Pascal Siakam or Jalen Brown or
Right.
Mikal Bridges. Um, I would highly doubt that they would get that Blazers pick, but maybe they get a future second round pick, or they push it down the line so that the Bulls get a lower protection in a future year.
Sure.
Um, they do have a lot of leverage. I'm not sure how much they could squeeze, but if I'm AK, I'm making them work for every cent that's worth because
Yeah.
that could be the one clear avenue for the Bulls to get some draft capital back when a lot of that is already out the window.
Yeah, I was gonna say you're gonna need as much draft capital as you can possibly get at this point for the Bulls. Will, as always, my man, I really appreciate you making the time. It means a lot to me and all of us Bulls fans. Keep up the great work at CHGO. We love all the content you guys have been putting out. And yeah, best of luck to the offseason and going into next season.
I appreciate it and happy to come back anytime. This was fun.